Good afternoon. It is Tuesday, February 27th, 2024. In the passage of Scripture we're looking at today, we've had the triumphal entry. Jesus came into Jerusalem, he looked around, went back out to Bethany, spent the night. On the way back in the next morning, he cursed the fig tree. And now in Mark chapter 11, verses 15 to 17, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation, second edition, says, when they arrived back in Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people buying and selling animals for sacrifices. He knocked over the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. And he stopped everyone from using the temple as a marketplace. He said to them, "The scriptures declare, my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a den of thieves." Talk about not needing to keep a low profile. He came into the temple this day and he literally kicked tail and took names, he turned over tables. He made a mess. He irritated everybody that was there. First thing he says it did is he drove out the people who were buying and selling animals for sacrifice. Now, God's instructions for the scripture was that when you brought an animal for sacrifice, you picked the best out of the animals that you had at your farm or your house, and you brought them in without blemish, and you brought them from home. Well, what would happen was you'd have to take it to the priest, and the priest would examine it to see if it would fit, if it was suitable, if it was worthy. And what would tend to happen is they bring it to the temple and the priest would look at it and say, oh, no, there's something wrong with this one. This one's not good enough for the sacrifice. But my cousin has a shop over here and he's selling animals, and I guarantee you my cousin's animals, they'll pass the inspection and you'll be able to sacrifice them. And so instead of taking the animal they brought from home, they had to go sell it at that stall and get just pennies for it. And then they purchase another one, much more expensive, and take that in. Sure enough, that one would pass. Well, guess what happened to the one they just sold back in? They'd sell it to somebody else a little bit later. They're buying and selling the animals meant for sacrifice and forcing the poor people to have to cough up extra money in order to sacrifice. They were scammers instead of following the scripture, and they were using the temple sacrifices and the need to have the animals ready in order to scam the poor people coming trying to worship. They mentioned the table of the money changers. Everywhere else in the area they used Roman money. That was the common currency of the area. That's what they used in all of the stores and all transactions. Except at the temple. You had to have Jewish temple money for temple taxes. And so they had a money changer. And they made just, a small percentage on each exchange. But they were there not to help people pay their temple taxes. They were there to take their percentage. Then they mentioned specifically the dove sellers. Now, the law said you're supposed to bring lambs or goats or cows for sacrifice. But if you're poor, you could bring a dove instead if you couldn't afford the animals. And so here you've got the people where they're taking the most advantage of is the poor. Instead of them being able to go out and just catch a dove for free, all of a sudden they're having to buy the doves. And it's making it that much harder for the people to worship in the way God intended. Jesus was angry because these people are taking what God intended for worship and they're using it to extort money from people and make a profit. And he quotes from both Isaiah and Jeremiah where he said, God's intention, the scripture declares, my temple will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've turned it into a den of thieves. taken what was meant for prayer, for sacrifice, for forgiveness, and you've taken it into becoming a source of personal revenue. Not to lift up God, but to take from the poor for personal gain. And Jesus was angry. And he kicked them out. He made them leave. It is supposed to be a place of prayer. This week, may you have prayer that is real and honest before God, and not merely a means to try and enrich yourself. God bless you.